Have you ever walked into your childhood home and just for a moment felt like a stranger in your own story? My name is Madison Walker, and if you've ever wondered whether you truly belonged, or if maybe you were just playing the role someone else wrote for you, you'll understand why I need to tell this story tonight. In a family where love was measured in chores done and sacrifices made, it was always easy to see who the sun shined brightest upon. Growing up, I learned how to disappear in plain sight quietly perfect, while my little sister Natalie seemed to be the reason every holiday sparkled. But this isn't just a story about unfairness or jealousy. It's about the ache of being invisible and the wild hope that one day you'll step out from the shadows and be seen for who you are. I used to believe that if I did everything right, good grades, perfect manners, never asking for help, then maybe I'd earn my place at the table. But love in our house didn't work that way. Natalie was the child who could do no wrong, the one who always landed softly no matter how far she fell. I was the responsible one, the fixer, the backup plan. Even as an adult, I watched the same patterns play out. Every crisis was mine to solve every mistake I cleaned up. Every phone call a summons to rescue someone who had never learned how to swim. You see, family expectations can look like love from the outside, but inside they can feel like a weight you never asked to carry. If you've ever found yourself lying awake at night, replaying old arguments, or wishing you could trade guilt for peace, I hope you'll find a piece of yourself in my journey. This isn't just my story. It's for anyone who's ever been told to put family first, even when it cost them everything. Over the next hour, I'll share how I reached my breaking point, how saying no to the people who raised me was the bravest and loneliest thing I've ever done, and how I learned that boundaries aren't walls, but doors to a new kind of freedom. Tonight, I want to invite you to listen not just with your ears, but with your heart. We'll walk through memories both beautiful and bruised, explore the high price of unconditional loyalty, and most of all, discover together what it really means to choose yourself, even when it means letting go of the only family you've ever known. Because sometimes in the quiet that follows the storm, we finally learn to hear our own voice, and that voice, no matter how small, deserves to be heard. So before we begin, I want to ask, when was the last time you felt truly seen by the people you love? And what might your life look like if you started living for yourself instead of for the expectations of others? Stay with me. This journey is just beginning, and I promise you're not alone. Let's step forward together. When I close my eyes and reach back to the earliest days, what I remember isn't so much the big moments, but the quiet in-between ones. The soft thud of Natalie's footsteps down the hallway on Saturday mornings, the way sunlight filtered through our kitchen window, dust motes swirling as if they carried stories all their own. Our house sat on a tree-lined street outside Seattle, a pretty place if you didn't look too closely. To neighbors, we must have seemed perfect. 2 daughters, 2 parents, front yard always trimmed. But every family photo has its shadows, and mine was always hiding in plain sight. My childhood was a lesson in the art of blending in, never too loud, never too much trouble, never needing more than what was offered. If you were the easy child, maybe, you know what I mean, your gold star was invisibility. I still remember the first time I noticed how differently Mom's eyes softened for Natalie. I was maybe 7, struggling to tie my own shoes, while Natalie, barely 5, sobbed over her untied laces. Mom rushed to comfort her, scooping her into her lap. "Don't worry, sweetie, big sister will help you." That was the refrain. Madison will help, Madison will wait, Madison will understand. It seemed harmless at first, almost funny. But when you're the older child and every accident or tantrum is somehow your responsibility, you learn to carry more than just your own mistakes. By the time I was 10, I'd learned to predict Natalie's meltdowns and preempt them to hand over the bigger slice of cake to finish my homework quietly in the corner, while Natalie's late assignments were the family's group project. I thought this was normal. I thought love was earned by being good. As we grew, so did the distance between us. Natalie was the star of every school play, whether or not she'd learned her lines, because my parents would fill the front row with flowers and applause regardless. I learned early not to expect praise for a perfect report card, just questions about why my math grade wasn't an A+. If Natalie's soccer team lost, Mom was there with ice cream and hugs. If I lost, it was, "Life is tough, Madison, get used to it." It wasn't that my parents didn't care about me. It was that Natalie always seemed to need more, and in a household where attention was rationed, neediness trumped quiet competence every time. It's funny the things that stick with you. On my 13th birthday, my parents forgot to pick up the cake I'd requested. "We'll get one next weekend," Mom promised, "but Natalie has a recital today. Why don't you come cheer her on instead?" I did. Of course I did. My job was to be proud, supportive, self-sacrificing. Even now, looking back, I'm less angry about the missed birthday than I am about how quickly I learned to accept it. I became an expert at shrinking myself to fit the gaps no one else wanted to fill. If you've ever stayed up late making posters for your siblings' campaign, or quietly handed over your own birthday wish so they could have it, you know how quietly this pattern carves itself into your bones. But invisibility is heavy, and it leaves a mark. By high school, I was the girl everyone liked, but no one really knew. I got good at reading rooms, at anticipating moods, especially moms who seemed perpetually tired and exasperated, and dads whose silence was as solid as granite. Natalie breezed through adolescence always a little bit lost, but always somehow forgiven. There was the time she crashed Dad's car backing out of the driveway. Accidents happen. Mom soothed as the insurance bill landed on the table. I thought about the summer I worked double shifts to help pay for my own used car, wondering if anyone even remembered. I didn't complain. I convinced myself that my independence was a gift, that if I didn't ask for help, I could avoid disappointment. Sometimes the lesson we're taught is that love must be proven, not given. I watched friends from school, Megan, whose mother tucked handwritten notes into her lunchbox, or Aaron, whose dad would shout from the sidelines at every track meet, move through life with a confidence I couldn't name. My parents loved me in their way, I told myself, and it wasn't their fault if that love felt more like expectation than comfort. For years, I carried a quiet ache, the sense that if I could just be better, just try harder, I'd finally be worthy of the affection Natalie received so easily. If you've ever looked for your reflection in someone else's approval, you'll understand the exhaustion of never quite measuring up. It's easy from the outside to see these moments as small slights to say it couldn't have been that bad. But the truth is, a lifetime of small wounds can shape the person you become. I became the helper, the fixer, the steady hand everyone counted on. Teachers adored me, bosses praised me, but inside I kept waiting for someone to notice how tired I was. I watched as Natalie was bailed out of trouble again and again, late assignments, lost jobs, failed friendships. While I quietly stitched my own safety net, my reward for responsibility was simply more responsibility, and I bore it well. I bore it quietly. Here's the strange thing: you start to believe that your value is in what you can do for others, not who you are. It's a hard habit to break this tendency to say yes, even when you want to scream no. There's a kind of pride in being the one who can handle anything, but also a deep loneliness. Looking back, I wish I'd known sooner that self-worth isn't earned through sacrifice. That's the lesson I want to share with you now. Your needs matter, even if no one ever told you so. If you're wondering whether this pattern can really last a lifetime, the answer is yes, unless you find a reason to change it. For me, that realization came slowly and painfully. It took years of being the dependable one, the steady one, before I realized that I was quietly fading from my own story. My greatest mistake wasn't loving my family too much, but loving myself too little. I want you to remember that caring for others should never mean erasing yourself. All stories have a turning point, a moment when what's always been just the way things are starts to feel unbearable. My story isn't unique, but it is personal. Maybe you've lived something similar, always the strong one, the reliable one, the invisible one. If so, I hope you'll let my story be a mirror or maybe a window out of your own loneliness. Because change is possible, but only if you're willing to see the truth of where you've come from. And so as we move forward, I want you to keep that question close. What part of yourself have you hidden away just to make life easier for everyone else? In the next chapter, I'll share how my early independence, the freedom I thought I'd earned, became its own kind of burden, and how growing up alone doesn't always mean you know how to be free. Stay with me as the journey continues. Freedom. It's a word that sounds so bright and clean, isn't it? At 18, I craved it with every part of myself. Freedom from curfews, from being invisible, from always holding my tongue so the house stayed peaceful. When I left for college on the other side of the city, I thought I'd finally crossed the finish line. I pictured my new life as a series of open doors, making my own rules, coming home to a tiny apartment that was all mine, building a world no one could shrink me in. But what no one tells you is how lonely freedom can feel when you've been trained your whole life to put other people first. Moving into my first apartment should have felt like a victory lap. I bought mismatched dishes from the thrift store, hung a string of fairy lights above my battered desk, and started learning to cook actual food instead of just boiling ramen. But each night after my roommate fell asleep, the silence would press in around me. I'd scroll through photos of Natalie at home birthday dinners, holiday mornings, all without me. At first, I thought I was homesick. But it was something deeper, the ache of realizing that even when you step away, the family you leave behind doesn't reach for you the way you reach for them. College was a full-time juggling act. My parents' contribution to my education ended at a pile of brochures and a wish for good luck. "You're so responsible, Madison, you'll figure it out," Mom had said, while Dad just nodded in the background. So I did what I'd always done. I worked. I pulled shifts at the campus bookstore, then waited tables on weekends, sometimes sneaking in an extra few hours babysitting for a professor's kids. My grades mattered. Scholarships were my only hope of staying afloat. Each semester was a patchwork of careful budgeting, endless checklists, and silent prayers that my old Honda wouldn't finally give up on the highway. Meanwhile, Natalie was still at home, changing majors and boyfriends, like seasons, knowing Mom and Dad would cover her rent if she needed it. There's a special kind of strength that comes from making it on your own, but there's also a silent cost. I learned to count every penny to patch jeans instead of buying new ones to say no to road trips and parties, because I couldn't risk missing a shift. Sometimes when friends would complain about their parents nagging them to call home or send grades, I'd wonder what it was like to be missed, to have someone care enough to worry out loud. My calls home were brief, usually about Natalie's latest drama or Mom's complaints about work. They almost never asked if I was okay, and if they did, I'd lie and say I was fine. One spring in the middle of midterms, I got bronchitis so bad I could barely speak. I texted Mom hoping for a little comfort. She replied, "Sorry, honey, things are crazy with Natalie right now. Drink lots of fluids." I stayed bundled under blankets for days, shuffling to class with a fever and making soup from instant noodles and leftover veggies. My roommate's mom dropped off orange juice and cold medicine. That tiny act of kindness hit me harder than I expected. I realized that family isn't always who shares your last name. Sometimes it's the people who show up when you need them, no questions asked. Despite everything I wore, my independence like a shield. When my car broke down before finals, I didn't call home. I borrowed a bike from a classmate and pedaled through the rain. When my landlord raised the rent, I picked up another shift. Friends would sometimes ask why I never asked my family for help, and I'd shrug embarrassed to explain. I didn't want pity or worse to seem like I was complaining. I'd convinced myself that being self-sufficient meant I didn't have the right to need anything from anyone. The lesson I wish I'd learned sooner is this. There's a difference between independence and isolation. It's good to stand on your own 2 feet, but not if it means standing alone out of habit or pride, or the belief that needing help makes you weak. Looking back, I can see how I wore my struggles as proof that I was strong, never realizing that true strength is letting people in, even when it feels unfamiliar or risky. When I finally graduated with honors after 4 years of juggling work school and the ache of missing out, I hoped for a moment of recognition. Natalie had dropped out by then, drifting from one passion to the next, her crises always cushioned by our parents' support. My family didn't even come to the ceremony. "Flights are expensive and Natalie has finals," Mom said. "We'll celebrate next time you're home." I watched other students hug their parents, pose for family photos, and for a long moment I envied them not for the gifts or the applause, but for the simple joy of being someone's first priority. Still, there were small victories. I found a job in tech support and worked my way up. I learned to build friendships that felt like family, to set tiny roots in a city that was finally starting to feel like home. Jamie, my best friend since college, became the sister I'd always needed, steady funny, and there for every milestone. We celebrated birthdays with takeout and silly hats. When I got promoted, Jamie threw confetti in the parking lot. Those were the moments that began to stitch me back together. If you're listening to this and thinking your own independence feels lonely, sometimes I want you to know it's okay to wish for more. There's no prize for suffering in silence, no badge for pretending you don't need what every human being craves: love, reassurance, a place to belong. If you've ever felt guilty for longing to be cared for, you're not alone. I spent years believing that needing help was a burden, until I realized that accepting kindness is its own kind of strength. The pattern was set, but I didn't see it yet. Each time Natalie called home in a panic, Mom would move heaven and earth to help her. When I called, it was just to check in, to be the good daughter. I never wanted to be a problem, but problems have a way of finding you, even when you're quiet. It would take a crisis, a demand so unfair it shocked me into clarity to finally break the spell. That was when my family would ask me for something I couldn't give, and I'd be forced to choose stay invisible or stand up for myself once and for all. And that, I suppose, is where the real story begins. It was late autumn when the call came, a Tuesday, gray and drizzling, the sort of Pacific Northwest day that makes you want to curl up under a blanket and pretend the world doesn't exist. I was at work, elbows deep in code and deadlines, when my phone started buzzing. It was my mother. I stared at her name for a moment, caught between habit and hope. Calls from Mom usually meant one thing: something had gone wrong with Natalie. Still, I answered because a part of me still wanted to believe this time might be different. Her voice was syrupy sweet, almost unrecognizable at first. She asked about my job, my health, whether I was eating enough, questions she rarely bothered with. I felt my guard rise. This wasn't her usual script. Then, with the softest sigh, she delivered the reason for her call. "Honey, I need your help. Natalie is in trouble." The details poured out quickly. Natalie, it turned out, had racked up nearly $50,000 in debt, some with credit cards, some with people my mother described only as the wrong crowd. My heart sank, not from shock, but from the dull ache of inevitability. Natalie had always been reckless with money, trusting luck or someone else to save her. I tried to ask questions, but Mom brushed them aside. "What matters is that she's your sister and she needs you." It was the old refrain, polished and ready. I sat at my desk, phone pressed to my ear, feeling the familiar pressure of guilt. My mother's voice wobbled as if she might cry. "You're so successful, Madison. You have a good job, a nice apartment. Natalie just isn't as strong as you. She's always needed more help." For a moment, I wanted to cave, to be the hero one more time. But $50,000 was more than I could possibly spare without destroying my own future. I swallowed hard and told her gently, "I'm sorry, Mom. I can't do that." That's when the conversation changed. The sweetness vanished, replaced by accusation. "You're abandoning your family after everything we've done for you. If something happens to Natalie, it will be on your conscience." The words landed like stones, heavy and deliberate. I was reminded of every previous time I'd been asked to give, to fix, to patch up messes I didn't make. This was just a bigger storm, but the pattern was painfully familiar. My mind flashed back to high school, when I'd used my first paycheck to buy Natalie a new phone after she broke hers. Or the time in college when I lent her money for rent, only to quietly accept that I'd never see it again. It's strange the ways guilt can be wielded within a family, like a leash that tugs at your every boundary. I hung up that afternoon feeling sick and unsettled, replaying the call in my head. Was I being selfish? Was I a bad sister? I checked my bank account over and over, doing the mental math, knowing even if I emptied my savings, it wouldn't be enough to solve Natalie's problems for long. Worse, I knew that saying yes would only invite the next crisis and the next, because as long as I was willing to rescue her, Natalie would never have to learn how to stand on her own. That night I spoke to Jamie, my best friend and my compass. I laid out the story word for word, watching her face as I described my family's expectations. She shook her head, fierce and kind. "Madison, it's not your job to fix this. Loving someone doesn't mean sacrificing yourself for their mistakes." She reminded me of times she'd drawn boundaries with her own family and how hard but necessary it had been. Her words steadied me. Sometimes you need someone outside the storm to remind you what dry land feels like. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that family loyalty is a beautiful idea, but it can turn into a trap if it demands you give up your own well-being. We're taught that love means saying yes, but sometimes real love is saying no, and trusting that the people you care about can face their own challenges. I remembered something I'd read once: you can't set yourself on fire to keep others warm. That phrase echoed in my mind as I drifted to sleep, wrestling with what I owed my family and what I owed myself. The days that followed were a blur of anxious texts and voicemails. My mother's messages grew sharper. Natalie sent long, rambling apologies layered with subtle guilt. "You're the only one I can count on. I wish I could be strong like you." The temptation to fix things was almost physical. Each message pressed on old wounds, the kind that never fully heal. But each time I held firm. I told myself over and over that protecting my future was not the same as abandoning my family. It was simply the first time I'd chosen to protect myself. Looking back, I wish I could tell my younger self that saying no doesn't make you heartless. It makes you wise. Every family has patterns, roles we step into as children, and sometimes never step out of. I'd been the caretaker for so long that I'd forgotten how to care for myself. Breaking that cycle was painful, but it was also the first true act of self-respect I'd ever managed. The lesson, I think, is this: compassion doesn't mean compliance. You can love people deeply without letting them hurt you, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to let others face the consequences of their own choices. That's how real growth happens on both sides. But boundaries are rarely welcomed in families built on sacrifice. My refusal became the spark that set off a storm I never saw coming. The guilt trip turned into anger, then into open hostility, as if years of buried resentments were suddenly unleashed. I was about to learn just how hard it is to change your role in a family that needs you to stay exactly as you are. And that is where the next chapter begins: the escalation, the backlash, and what it truly means to break the rules that have shaped your whole life. If you've ever tried to set a new boundary in an old relationship, you know that it rarely goes quietly. In my case, the backlash started almost instantly. It began as a trickle and extra call from my mother, a longer than usual text from Natalie, but by the end of the week it was a flood. My phone became a battleground, each buzz and ping, another reminder that saying no to my family wasn't the end of the story. In fact, it was just the beginning. The guilt arrived in waves, carefully crafted and relentless. My mother would call late at night, her voice tight with hurt, saying things like, "I just don't understand how you could turn your back on us," or, "After everything we've sacrificed, is this really the kind of daughter you want to be?" She left voicemails that ranged from pleading to angry, some filled with silence except for the faint sound of her crying. Natalie texted me at all hours sometimes, apologetic, sometimes accusatory. "I'm scared, Maddie. I know I messed up, but you're the only one who's ever been there for me." When those words didn't work, she tried another angle. "It must be nice to have your life together. Not everyone is as lucky as you." Even my father, usually silent and distant, chimed in, "It's family, Madison. You don't just walk away when things get hard." It's amazing how quickly your world can feel like it's closing in. Each message felt like a tiny rip in the seams of my resolve. Old doubts resurfaced. Was I being selfish, as they claimed? Was my job, my apartment, my modest savings really such a fortress that I could afford to shut everyone else out? I replayed every moment of my childhood, every time I'd stepped up or smoothed things over, and wondered if this finally was the moment I'd gone too far. The guilt was so familiar, it almost felt comfortable, a well-worn coat I wasn't ready to hang up. But beneath the guilt, I started to recognize something more insidious: gaslighting. When I questioned the fairness of their expectations, my mother would insist I was imagining things, or that I was too sensitive. If I pointed out that Natalie's mistakes had been covered up or excused for years, I was accused of jealousy or bitterness. The past was rewritten in real time with me as the ungrateful villain. It was a strange and dizzying feeling to know your own memories, your own reality, but to be told again and again that you had it all wrong. One night, unable to sleep, I scrolled through old photos on my phone. There I was at Natalie's graduation, cheering, smiling, holding a bouquet I'd bought with tips from my weekend job. I remembered missing my own final exams that day, but no one in my family had noticed. There was Natalie's birthday party where I'd spent hours baking her favorite cake, only to watch her unwrap presents and laugh with her friends while I cleaned up the mess. The pattern was clear, but I still struggled to believe that love could be so conditional, so transactional. I started searching online for stories like mine. I found forums and videos about toxic family dynamics, parentification, and emotional manipulation. Reading other people's words, people who had grown up in homes where love was earned, not given, was strangely comforting. It reminded me that I wasn't alone, that these patterns were real, and that they had names. I wrote in my journal for the first time in years, listing out the ways I'd been asked to give the things I'd quietly lost, the needs I'd buried just to keep the peace. The next morning, I met Jamie for coffee. She listened as I recounted the messages and the way they made me feel both guilty and somehow invisible all over again. Jamie told me about her cousin who had gone through something similar and the years it had taken for her to untangle love from obligation. "You're allowed to protect yourself," she said, squeezing my hand. "You're allowed to say no, even to family." It was a truth I desperately needed to hear. Sometimes the greatest kindness is reminding someone that their feelings are valid, that their pain matters. The lesson I learned in those days was both simple and profound. Guilt is not always a sign that you're doing something wrong. Sometimes it's just a signal that you're breaking an old habit, a habit of saying yes when you want to say no, a habit of prioritizing others at your own expense. It takes practice to listen to your own needs, to trust your own experience. For me, it took every ounce of courage I had to keep that boundary in place, to answer calls less often, to let voicemails sit unheard. What I didn't expect was how quickly the guilt trip would escalate into something sharper: anger, resentment, even threats. My family's disappointment turned into blame, and blame soon hardened into hostility. Suddenly, I wasn't just the daughter who said no, I was the enemy, the traitor, the one who'd changed. The house I'd grown up in, the family dinners and holidays I'd always tried to save, now felt like distant memories. I found myself grieving not just the people I'd lost, but the person I'd been, the peacemaker, the fixer, the one who belonged. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's that boundaries don't break families. Secrets and resentment do. Setting limits doesn't make you cold or uncaring. It's how you protect the love that's left, and it's how you protect yourself. I wish more people knew that before they spent years, as I did, twisting themselves into knots for the approval of others. In the weeks that followed, I realized that my family's anger was less about the money than it was about losing control. I had changed the rules, and suddenly everyone had to adjust. For the first time, I began to wonder what would happen if I put my needs first, not just once, but always. What if the love I'd been searching for wasn't something I had to earn at all? That thought scared me, but it also gave me hope, because sometimes the end of one story is really just the start of another. And for me, that next chapter began when the consequences of standing my ground became more serious and far more personal than I ever imagined. I thought the storm would pass if I just waited it out. Maybe if I held firm long enough, my family would let it go and life would find its balance again. But with every unanswered call and unopened message, a deeper current of desperation took hold. Then, just as the dust began to settle, a new wave crashed in, one that left me shaken in ways I never expected. It started with a phone call I almost didn't answer. My bank's number flashed on my screen, strange since I did most of my banking online and never expected a real person to call. The voice on the other end was polite but serious. There had been an attempt to access my accounts with mismatched identification. "We've put a temporary lock on your accounts for your safety," the banker explained. For a moment, I was confused, even a little embarrassed. Had I done something wrong? But as the details came into focus, someone had tried to transfer money using information that only a family member would know. My confusion turned to something cold and sharp: betrayal. My mind immediately went to Natalie. I remembered the pleading texts, the mounting pressure, and the recent escalation into anger. Was it really possible my own sister, or someone she'd enlisted, had tried to take what wasn't theirs. I called the bank back asking for more information, but privacy laws limited what they could tell me. I sat on my couch clutching my phone, my heart pounding as reality sank in. The idea that family, the people who should be your safest place, could cross such a line was both shocking and oddly clarifying. The unspoken rules I'd grown up with help, cover, forgive suddenly seemed paper thin. Later that night, I stared at the ceiling, replaying the weeks and months that had brought me here. Every small ask, every guilt trip, every quiet expectation that I would fix things, or make them right now, took on a different meaning. I realized how often financial boundaries are blurred in families, especially when old patterns of caretaking run deep. A loan here, a gift there, over time, it all adds up. And so do the resentments. But this was different. This wasn't a request. It was a violation. I thought about stories I'd read online, grown children whose parents drained their savings, siblings who forged signatures, even cases where lawsuits tore families apart over money that was supposed to bind them. It's more common than people admit, especially when loyalty is confused with responsibility. I'd always believed I was immune to that kind of betrayal simply because I kept my head down, did the right thing, and never made a fuss. But the truth is, healthy boundaries are needed precisely because trust can be broken by anyone, even the ones you love most. The next day I met Jamie for a walk. As we wandered through the park, leaves crunching underfoot, I told her everything. Her reaction was a mix of anger and fierce protectiveness. You need to protect yourself, Madison. Family or not, this crosses the line. She reminded me of how often women especially are taught to be the peacemakers, to keep things together no matter the cost. But you're not responsible for other people's choices, she said, her voice softening. You never were. That conversation lingered with me. I started thinking about all the times I'd absorbed blame, let myself be the solution, and justified my own discomfort for the sake of peace. When financial abuse happens, it rarely starts big. It begins with a favor, a small loan, a little secret. Over time, it grows until one day you realize you're drowning in someone else's decisions. My story wasn't unique. It was just my turn to decide what came next. The lesson I learned in those days was this: trust and boundaries go hand in hand. Loving someone doesn't mean granting them unlimited access to your life, your time, or your money. It's not cruel to protect yourself. In fact, it's the foundation of any healthy relationship. I took practical steps, resetting all my passwords, double-checking every account, even reaching out to a lawyer friend for advice just in case. I was scared, but I was also determined not to be a victim in my own life story. And then there was the emotional piece, the grief that comes when you see someone you love, not as the person you hoped they'd be, but as someone capable of hurting you. That realization is a quiet heartbreak, the kind that sits in your chest long after the danger has passed. I grieved the loss of innocence, the belief that family could never cross certain lines. But I also felt something new resolve. I wasn't going to shrink or hide anymore. Sometimes the wake-up call we need isn't gentle. It's the shock of a boundary crossed, the sting of betrayal. In those moments, you can choose to keep playing your old role, or step into a new one where your safety and peace matter as much as anyone else's. I chose the latter, and it changed everything. As I gathered my courage to confront Natalie and my parents about what had happened, I realized the next chapter would test me in ways I'd never been tested before. Because standing up for yourself isn't just a one-time act. It's a practice, a promise you make to the person you're becoming. And for me, that journey was just beginning. In the next part of my story, I would face the most difficult conversations of my life, honest, raw, and full of truths that had been buried for years. But I knew finally that I was ready. Confronting your own family is a kind of heartbreak you can't really prepare for. Still, I knew I couldn't let this slide, not just for my savings account, but for my own sense of dignity. I needed to hear it from Natalie's lips, even if I already knew the truth. So with my hand shaking and my heart stubbornly steady, I drove across town to her apartment. All the way there, memories flashed in my mind. Birthday parties, late-night confessions, every moment I'd chosen her needs above my own. But this wasn't about history or loyalty anymore. It was about boundaries. Natalie opened the door, looking surprised, as if she thought all the drama would blow over as it always had before. She wore her exhaustion like a shield hair and a messy knot eyes, darting anywhere but my face. "Hey, Maddie," she said, a hint of nervousness in her voice. I didn't waste time. "Did you try to get into my bank account?" I asked, showing her the alert from my phone. For a split second, her mask slipped. Guilt flickered in her eyes, but then she shrugged defensive. What was I supposed to do? "You said no." I was desperate. Her words were soft, but there was an edge in them too, a dare for me to challenge the script our family had always followed. It's a strange feeling watching someone you love justify crossing a line you thought was sacred. Part of me wanted to scream. Another part wanted to pull her into a hug and fix everything like I'd done 1,000 times before. Instead, I took a shaky breath and tried to be honest. "Natalie, this isn't just about money. It's about trust, and you broke it." She bristled, voice rising. "Easy for you to say, you always had it together. I never did." The accusation landed harder than I expected. For so long, I'd thought my responsibility was to compensate for her chaos. Now I saw how it had kept us both stuck. I told her quietly but firmly that I couldn't rescue her anymore, that I loved her, but I was done being her safety net. She rolled her eyes, pushing past the pain with anger. "Whatever. Mom said you'd come around if things got bad enough." The words stung not just for their content, but for the reminder of how deeply these old patterns ran. My own mother had encouraged this escalation, trusting the family dynamic more than her own daughter's boundaries. I wanted so badly for Natalie to apologize, to show even a flicker of remorse, but instead she crossed her arms and glared. "You think you're so much better than me. You wouldn't even be where you are without Mom and Dad." The words hurt, because there was a seed of truth. We all build ourselves from the raw material of our upbringing, even when it's flawed. But I also knew I'd built my life with my own sweat, my own sacrifices. I stood a little taller as I told her I worked for every bit of what I have. No one ever bailed me out. I need you to see that. Real-life confrontations are rarely neat, and ours ended not with closure, but with exhaustion. I left her apartment feeling like I'd run a marathon with no finish line. In the car, I let myself cry, not just for Natalie, but for the relationship I realized I might be losing for good. That's the secret no one tells you about boundaries. They protect you, but sometimes they cost you too. The people you love might not change, and you have to learn to live with that. Over the next few days, my family's responses grew even sharper. My mother called in a panic, demanding to know why I was tearing the family apart. She insisted I was overreacting, that Natalie was just going through a rough patch. My father, silent for so long, sent a curt message. "You're making a mistake." In the face of their anger, I did what I could to protect myself. I changed passwords, alerted my bank, and spoke with a lawyer just to understand my options. Each practical step was an act of self-respect, a tiny rebellion against the person I'd always been expected to be. The hardest part, though, was the grief. Setting boundaries meant accepting that my family might never see my side of things, never acknowledge my hurt, never be willing to do the work of healing. It's easy to tell yourself you're strong enough to stand alone, but there are nights when the silence in your apartment feels like punishment. On those nights, I leaned hard on Jamie and my other friends, the family I'd chosen. Their understanding, their reminders that I wasn't crazy or cruel, became the rope I used to pull myself out of the old story. If you've ever been through something like this, you know the lesson boundaries aren't meant to change other people. They're meant to protect you. Sometimes standing your ground doesn't lead to a happy ending or a heartfelt apology. Sometimes it just leads to space, the space you need to finally breathe. That space can be terrifying, but it's also fertile ground for growth. In those raw, unsteady weeks, I realized something else. It's not just about drawing a line. It's about grieving what you hoped your family could be and making peace with what they are. You can love people deeply and still accept that their choices are out of your control. I didn't stop loving Natalie, but I did stop sacrificing myself for her comfort. As the weeks passed, I could feel the ground shifting beneath my feet. The next stage would bring new challenges, pressure at work, public embarrassment, and the feeling that my private family drama was spilling into every corner of my life. But for the first time, I was facing it with my eyes open, determined to choose myself, even when it hurt. And that, in the end, is what makes real healing possible. The moment you stop asking for permission to protect your own heart, you begin to discover a life that belongs to you. The cost is real, but so is the freedom. In the next chapter, I'll share how my family's anger turned outward, how it followed me to my job, my friendships, and forced me to decide how much of my life I was willing to reclaim. There's a myth that family drama stays at home, tucked away behind closed doors. I used to believe that too. But when the people closest to you are determined to pull you back into their storm, the fallout finds its way into every corner of your life, even the ones you thought were safe. For me, the next act of our family saga wasn't played out in private, but on the stage of my workplace, my friendships, and my sense of belonging. Suddenly, I wasn't just navigating old patterns at home. I was fending off shadows in places that had always felt like my refuge. It started on an ordinary Monday just after I'd begun to find a fragile sense of peace again. The receptionist at my office called up to my desk. "There's a woman here asking for you." My stomach dropped before she even finished the sentence. I knew deep down it could only be my mother. When I walked into the lobby, she was already red-faced and agitated, waving her phone in the air, her voice raised for everyone to hear. "How could you do this to us, Madison, after everything we've done for you?" Her words echoed in the tiled hall, bouncing off the curious stares of my coworkers. Embarrassment prickled across my skin, but beneath it was something sharper: anger and a flicker of resolve. Security escorted her out, but the damage lingered long after she'd gone. For days, I fielded questions from colleagues, some genuinely concerned, others hungry for gossip. My boss, Mr. Bennett, called me into his office, his tone gentle but firm. "Is everything all right at home? Is there anything we need to know?" I felt exposed. My carefully kept boundaries crumbling in real time. There's a special kind of pain in having your most private struggles made public, especially when you've spent your life trying not to make waves. I wanted to disappear. Instead, I found myself explaining as simply and honestly as I could that I was dealing with a difficult family situation and taking steps to manage it. To my relief, Mr. Bennett nodded. "Take the time you need," he said, "and remember we all have our battles." Still, the ripples didn't stop there. Natalie began posting cryptic, pity-seeking updates on social media, vague references to betrayal to sisters who forget where they came from. Mutual friends reached out, some offering support, others prodding for details. A few sided openly with Natalie, repeating the old story that I was too proud or too cold. It was a strange feeling to lose people you'd known for years, not because of anything you did, but because you refused to keep playing a role that no longer fit. Jamie Ever, the steady anchor, reminded me. Anyone who judges you without knowing your heart was never really in your corner. Her faith in me became a lifeline, proof that the family you choose can matter just as much as the one you're born into. There were practical challenges, too. My parents sent a letter on real heavy paper this time, threatening legal action for abandoning family obligations. I knew enough to laugh at the empty threat, but the gesture still hurt. How quickly love turns to accusation when you stop giving in to someone else's idea of loyalty. I forwarded the letter to my lawyer friend, who reassured me there was no real case. Still, I took extra precautions. I blocked numbers, locked down my social media, and warned my apartment building to expect no guests. If I'm honest, there were nights when all of this felt like too much. The shame, the frustration, the deep sense of unfairness it seeped into my dreams left me restless and second-guessing. Was I really as heartless as they said? Was the cost of peace too high? On those nights, I reminded myself of the lesson I'd been learning, one hard moment at a time. Boundaries are not acts of cruelty. They are acts of self-respect. If you never defend your right to peace, there will always be someone willing to take it from you, often the very people who claim to love you most. What struck me in the quiet aftermath of every confrontation was how much energy I'd spent trying to protect other people's feelings at the expense of my own. I'd been so afraid of being called selfish, so determined not to be the villain, that I'd let my own needs disappear. But here's what I know now. Healthy relationships at work, in friendship and family, are built on mutual respect, not martyrdom. It's okay to need space. It's okay to insist on privacy. And it's more than okay to expect the people who love you to honor the lines you draw. With every new challenge, I became a little stronger, a little more myself. I started to see the power in telling the truth, even when it was awkward or uncomfortable. I began to open up more with my colleagues, not about the messy details, but about the reality that everyone has private battles. To my surprise, a few confided their own stories, strained relationships, painful boundaries, the struggle to be seen as a whole person. The empathy we shared in those quiet conversations became a hidden blessing, proof that vulnerability, when handled with care, can build bridges where walls once stood. There's a myth that we're meant to bear our burdens alone. But the real courage comes from admitting you need support and from letting others step in when the weight is too much. Each time I reached out, each time I told my story, instead of hiding it, the shame shrank a little more. I started to imagine a life where I didn't have to apologize for protecting myself, where I could build connections on honesty, not obligation. Of course, not everyone understood. Some relatives sent messages pleading for reconciliation. Others accused me of tearing the family apart. But I was learning to let those voices be just that, voices, not verdicts. The more I trusted my own perspective, the less power their judgment held. I realized with a quiet kind of pride that the only person who could truly define my worth was me. As the dust settled, I began to sense the first hints of real freedom. The world hadn't ended, even though my old life had. My job was safe, my friendships deeper, my sense of self just a little more whole. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time I believed I was strong enough to see it through. Next, I would face the final act of letting go, the painful but liberating decision to cut contact once and for all, and to build a life defined not by guilt, but by possibility. And that, as I would soon discover, was where true healing could finally begin. There's a moment in every journey where you realize you can't go back, no matter how much you wish things could be different. For me, that moment arrived on an ordinary Wednesday evening, as I sat alone at my kitchen table, surrounded by unopened letters and the hum of my phone's silent notifications. I looked at the pile messages from my parents, handwritten pleas from Natalie, even the official-looking envelope from their lawyer, and understood finally that it was time to do the thing I'd been dreading for months, go no contact completely and without apology. Making the decision felt surreal, as if I were stepping out of my own body and watching a braver version of myself take charge. I opened my laptop, crafted a short message to the few extended family members and old friends who still reached out. Please respect my boundaries. I am choosing to take a step back from my immediate family for my own well-being. I hope you can understand and won't pass messages on their behalf. Then, with trembling hands, I blocked my parents' and Natalie's numbers, their emails, even their social media profiles. I changed my privacy settings, double-checked every digital door. When I finally finished, I sat in the stillness and waited for regret to wash over me. But what I felt was quieter and unexpectedly peaceful, like setting down a weight I'd been carrying for years. The first week of no contact was harder than I ever imagined. My phone rang from unknown numbers, my work email filled with desperate subject lines. Just talk to us. You're punishing your own mother. You'll regret this one day. Each time I took a deep breath and hit delete. There was pain, of course, old guilt like a ghost tried to haunt my quieter moments. But I reminded myself that every no was a step closer to a life I'd chosen for myself, not one forced on me by the fears and needs of others. What surprised me most was how the outside world adjusted. A couple of my cousins who'd grown up witnessing the same family patterns sent quiet messages of support. I get it, one wrote. We're here if you ever want to talk, no judgment. A handful of mutual friends drifted away uncomfortable with the messiness of it all. But Jamie, steadfast as ever, brought over Thai takeout and movie nights, filling my apartment with laughter that sounded a lot like hope. Sometimes healing is just letting yourself be cared for in small, gentle ways. Yet there were setbacks. My mother found new numbers to call from leaving long emotional voicemails, sometimes crying, sometimes raging. My father's letters turned bitter, mixing disappointment with accusations. Natalie wrote one last desperate note this time, asking for a small loan, promising to change. It was tempting, even after everything, to answer to bargain to fix. But I held my line not out of anger, but out of hard-won self-respect. I learned that no can be an act of love, not just for yourself, but for the person who needs to stand on their own at last. Those first months without contact forced me to confront something I'd always feared, the feeling of being alone. But as the noise faded, I discovered something unexpected: relief. My mind was quieter. My body relaxed in ways I hadn't realized were possible. I had more energy at work, slept better, and even started picking up old hobbies, sketching long walks, lazy weekends spent lost in books. I wasn't waiting for the next crisis to drop. I could simply live. I also began to see the story from a wider angle. I realized how common my experience was, especially among women and eldest children, the pattern of being cast as the fixer, the one who keeps the peace. In online support groups and late-night articles, I read stories just like mine, and the sense of isolation slowly faded. I wasn't broken or unloving. I was simply tired of carrying a burden that was never really mine. With time, I reflected on the meaning of family. I used to believe that family was defined by blood, that loyalty meant endless sacrifice. Now I saw it differently. Family, I realized, could also be chosen. It could be friends who saw me, cousins who understood, colleagues who cheered me on. Most importantly, family included myself, the person I was becoming, the woman learning to trust her own voice at last. A lesson emerged from those quiet, reflective weeks. Boundaries aren't walls that keep people out. They are doors that protect your peace and let the right people in. Enforcing those boundaries may cost you relationships, but it gives you back your own life. I'd spent so long being afraid of what I'd lose if I stepped away. I never imagined what I'd gain: self-respect, calm the space to build something new. As the seasons changed and the world outside brightened, so did I. The panic attacks faded, replaced by long, deep breaths and the thrill of possibilities. My work flourished. My friendships deepened. I even opened up to new people, slowly at first, with honesty about where I'd come from and what I'd survived. To my surprise, many understood, some even shared their own stories, and the room felt less lonely. By now, my life was no longer defined by my family's chaos or their expectations. I began to imagine a future that belonged entirely to me, a future built not on guilt or fear, but on hope and genuine connection. I was building a home, one boundary at a time. The next step, I realized, would be healing, not just surviving, but truly thriving. In the chapters ahead, I'd learn how to fill the empty spaces with joy, trust, and the kind of love that doesn't require you to disappear. And maybe I'd find the courage to help others do the same. The first weeks of peace were tinged with both relief and uncertainty. Without the constant buzz of family drama, my days opened up in unexpected ways. There were mornings when sunlight spilled into my living room, soft and golden, and I'd just sit quietly with a mug of coffee, listening to the gentle hum of my own thoughts. At first, the quiet felt unnatural, like a song missing its refrain. But as the weeks stretched on, I found myself settling into this new rhythm, one where I was no longer defined by what others needed from me, but by what I wanted for myself. I started therapy with Dr. Fields, a kind-eyed woman who never rushed me. In those sessions, I learned to name things I'd only felt before: grief, anger, even hope. She encouraged me to journal, to track my small victories, making a favorite meal just for myself, finishing a book, inviting Jamie over for a movie night with no sense of obligation. We talked about reparenting, the idea that sometimes as adults, we have to give ourselves the care and acceptance we missed growing up. It sounded odd at first, but it became a quiet revolution. I bought myself flowers, gave myself permission to rest, forgave myself for not being perfect. With each passing day, I saw more clearly how much I'd given away in the name of peace. I'd sacrificed not just money or time, but parts of my identity, my creativity, my sense of play, even my trust. Now, with space to breathe, I found those pieces waiting for me. I began sketching again, something I hadn't done since college. My old sketchbook filled with gentle landscapes and little moments, the view from my window, a bowl of fresh fruit, the laughter lines around Jamie's eyes. I walked the city in the evenings, letting the sights and sounds remind me that I was alive in a world much bigger than my family's expectations. One afternoon, Jamie brought over a cake she'd baked, and we sat on the balcony watching the sky turn lavender at sunset. "You seem lighter," she said quietly. I smiled, surprised at the truth of it. I told her about therapy, about the slow process of learning to trust myself again. We talked about families, hers, mine, the ones we chose, and how hard it can be to unlearn the lessons of a lifetime. "You're brave," Jamie said. And for once, I let myself believe it. In the weeks that followed, I reached out gently to people I'd drifted from, not to explain or apologize, but to reconnect on my own terms. I found comfort in community groups, art classes, even a book club at the local library. Each new connection felt like planting a seed. Some grew quickly, others took time, but each reminded me that belonging isn't something you earn by giving yourself away. It's something that blooms when you show up as you truly are. A powerful lesson emerged. Real healing is both active and ongoing. It's not just about cutting ties with what hurts you, but about investing in what lifts you up. I stopped thinking of boundaries as walls and started seeing them as the fences around a blooming garden, protective, yes, but meant to nurture life, not keep it out. I learned to say yes to what felt good and no to what drained me without guilt or apology. Of course there were setbacks. Sometimes on holidays or quiet nights, I'd wonder what my family was doing, whether they missed me, whether things could ever be different. I allowed myself to grieve the family I wished I'd had the unconditional love I'd chased for so long. But I also learned to celebrate how far I'd come. I'd survived the loss, the loneliness, and come out the other side with a clearer sense of self. That was a kind of victory no one could take away from me. Perhaps the greatest change was how I began to trust myself with new relationships. I learned to be honest about my boundaries from the start, to choose friends and partners who respected my no as much as my yes. There was a quiet joy in building connections on mutual respect and genuine affection. It wasn't always easy. Old fears crept in, whispering that I might be too much or too distant. But I held on to what Dr. Fields had told me. You deserve relationships where you don't have to disappear to be loved. As the seasons changed, I realized my story wasn't just about escape or survival. It was about transformation, the slow, sometimes painful process of becoming your own safe place. Healing wasn't linear. It looped and twisted with setbacks and breakthroughs. But with every step, I grew stronger, more rooted in who I was, less afraid of what the world might bring. Now, when I look back at the person I was, a woman weighed down by guilt and old roles, I feel a deep compassion for her. She did her best with what she had. But I am grateful, too, for the woman I've become, one who claims her joy, sets her boundaries, and isn't afraid to begin again. And as my story nears its close, I find myself hoping that by sharing it, I can offer a little light for anyone traveling their own winding path. Because healing is possible, family is bigger than blood, and the future, if you're brave enough to choose it, belongs entirely to you. Soon, I would find the words to share what I'd learned with others, to turn my own experience into hope and guidance. But before that, I took one last gentle look back, grateful at last for the journey and for the self I'd finally come home to. Looking back, I see how every chapter of this journey, each painful conversation, each boundary drawn, each lonely night, has carried me to a place I never thought I'd reach. I began as the quiet, responsible daughter who measured her worth by the problems she solved for everyone else. I spent years believing that love had to be earned and that peace depended on never saying no. But slowly, step by step, I learned that true belonging starts with belonging to yourself. I've shared with you the weight of being the fixer, the heartbreak of disappointing people you love, and the relief that follows when you finally choose your own well-being. I've shown you how independence can become isolation, and how healing means learning to let others in again. I've walked you through guilt, anger, and the grief of letting go, as well as the beauty of discovering chosen family, honest friendships, and the power of saying enough. Every lesson was hard-won, every setback came with doubt, but every small act of courage created space for a bigger, kinder life. What I hope you take from my story is simple. You do not have to disappear to keep the peace. Your needs matter, your boundaries are valid, and your voice is worthy of being heard, especially by yourself. Healing isn't a destination, it's a practice. It's letting yourself forgive and begin again, even if that means walking away from people who can't or won't see you for who you are. And as hard as it can be, the other side of grief is freedom. The freedom to build a life on your own terms, to invite in only what nurtures and uplifts you. If you recognize parts of yourself in my journey, know that you're not alone. So many of us have been taught to put everyone else first, to believe that love is sacrifice without end. But you are allowed to choose yourself. You are allowed to rest. And you are allowed to say no without guilt. The world is full of people waiting to love you as you are. Sometimes family is found in the most unexpected places, in a friend's laughter, in a therapist's wisdom, even in the gentle way you care for yourself on a quiet evening. Thank you for walking with me through the mess and the magic of starting over. If my story has helped you or made you feel seen, I'd love for you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to set a boundary that changed your life? Do you have advice for someone struggling to choose themselves? Let's build a community where honesty and healing are celebrated. And if you want more stories about finding your voice, reclaiming your peace, and turning pain into purpose, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video with someone who might need a little encouragement today. Your story matters. Your peace matters. Here's to the courage it takes to choose yourself again and again.